He stormed into my backyard like he owned the place, jabbed a finger at my pool and shouted, "This belongs to us. We own the whole neighborhood." And I'll never forget the way the sheriff threw his head back and laughed right in his face. That laugh shattered his ego in front of everyone, but as wild as it sounds, that was only the beginning of the nightmare Karen and her husband dragged me into. I should back up. My name's Michael Carter, and I live in what I thought was a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Phoenix, Arizona. I worked my whole life to afford this house and that pool out back. It wasn't just a luxury, it was my sanctuary, my escape from the grind. On hot days when the air feels thick enough to chew, that pool is the one place I could breathe. But in this neighborhood, there's something worse than the desert heat, the HOA. And at the top of that HOA sits Karen Miller, a woman who seemed to thrive on nitpicking and intimidation. Her husband, Richard, acted like her self-appointed enforcer. Big guy, loud voice, the kind of presence that makes you feel like you're in trouble just for existing. Together they strutted around as if the whole block was their kingdom. The first time they came at me, it was almost surreal. It was a blistering afternoon. I was stretched out by the pool, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when I saw them marching down my driveway. Not strolling, not stopping to chat, marching with purpose. Karen had her arms crossed, smug little smirk plastered across her face. Richard didn't hesitate, just strode straight into my backyard up to the pool's edge and jabbed a finger toward the water. "This pool belongs to us. We own the neighborhood." At first I laughed, waiting for the punchline. Surely he was joking. But when I looked in his eyes, there was no smirk, no sarcasm. He meant it. My chest tightened, and I forced my voice to stay steady. "Excuse me, this is my property, my backyard, my pool." But Richard puffed up even more, squared his shoulders and barked louder. "We own the neighborhood. That pool is ours." He slapped his hand on my fence post like he was planting a flag. My patience snapped. "You need to leave now," I told him, adrenaline making my hands shake even as I stood my ground. And for a split second I honestly thought this could spiral into one of those tragic stories you hear on the news, neighbors clashing until things go too far. I wasn't taking chances. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff. Minutes later the deputies rolled up. Richard puffed up like he was about to deliver a speech on stage, repeated his claim to the officers with full confidence. Karen just stood behind him, lips curled, clearly savoring the show. And then it happened. The sheriff just stared at him, raised one brow, and burst out laughing. A deep, booming laugh that cut right through the air. Richard's face twisted like he'd bitten into a lemon. The sheriff finally shook his head and said flatly, "Sir, this isn't your property. You don't own this pool. You need to leave." In that moment, I felt a rush of relief, almost a victory. Watching them back down in front of the law was satisfying. But as they muttered and sulked their way off my property, I knew in my gut this wasn't over. People like Karen and Richard don't just slink away. They stew, they plot, and they come back stronger. Sure enough, within days, the retaliation began. Flyers stuffed into my mailbox full of vague warnings about HOA compliance and community standards. The language was always just ambiguous enough to make you question yourself. Neighbors started whispering, giving me sideways glances. Karen's reach wasn't wide, but it was toxic. And Richard, I'd catch him standing across the street, arms folded, glaring at my pool like a general surveying stolen land. One time he even tipped an imaginary crown at me, as if to say he ruled over all this. It wore on me. Every time I dipped into my pool, I felt their eyes on me. Every time I opened the mailbox, I expected another thinly veiled threat. I started losing sleep. The anxiety got under my skin. One night, staring at the ceiling, I thought to myself, maybe I should just sell the place, wash my hands of this whole mess. Maybe I was the one out of line. Was I the neighbor causing trouble? Was there some obscure rule I didn't know about? That's how far they pushed me. They made me doubt myself. But then a friend of mine, a lawyer, snapped me out of it. I vented to him, spilled everything, the claims, the flyers, the intimidation. He just shook his head and said, "Mike, they're bluffing. They can't take your property. Document everything. Build a wall of evidence and you'll crush them." That was my turning point. I went from prey to predator. I started saving every flyer, snapping photos of Richard lurking around, keeping timestamps of every knock, every look, every word. I pulled property records, dug up HOA payment receipts, and laid out my entire case in neat files. If this was going to be war, I was building a fortress. Then came the letter, hand-delivered, dripping with fake authority, signed by Karen herself. It accused me of aesthetic violations, demanded changes to my pool, and in the fine print, get this, it implied community ownership, like they thought they could rewrite reality on HOA letterhead. That was it. That was the last straw. I called the sheriff again. The deputy chuckled and said, "Sir, they can't take your pool. Just keep documenting. If this escalates, we'll step in." Hearing that grounded me. I wasn't crazy. They were. Still, their campaign didn't stop. The intimidation was constant, gnawing at me like termites under the floorboards. But now I had a purpose. It wasn't just about keeping a pool. It was about standing up to arrogance, about refusing to let people bully their way into controlling others. And then came the showdown. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was already burning hot, the water in the pool shimmering like glass. I was mid-swim when I spotted their car creeping down the street. My stomach dropped, but I climbed out of the pool, ready this time. They walked up, Richard waving another flyer, Karen smirking behind him. He launched into his usual tirade voice, booming, "Rules, ownership, control. This pool is ours." He was louder than ever, desperate to intimidate me back into submission. I let him finish, then took a breath and said calmly, "You've made your claims, but the law doesn't back you up. Leave now, or I'll call the sheriff again." For a moment, Richard actually froze, eyes wide, caught off guard that I wasn't flinching. Karen opened her mouth, but the heavy silence hanging over us choked her words. And that's when I pulled out my trump card, a neatly organized folder. Inside was everything: photos of property lines, HOA receipts, documentation of their harassment, every flyer, every time-stamped note. I spread it out right there on the pool's edge like exhibits in a courtroom. Their faces dropped. For once, Richard didn't have a comeback. Karen's smirk cracked into something closer to panic. I pulled out my phone and calmly called the sheriff one more time. The deputies showed up quickly. Richard tried his same performance, shouting that they owned the neighborhood. But this time the sheriff cut him off cold. "No, you don't own this pool. You don't own the neighborhood. Leave now or we'll take further action." And that was it. Richard's face turned crimson. His fists clenched, but the words died in his throat. Karen couldn't even meet my eyes. Under the sheriff's watch, they turned, walked back to their car, and drove off in silence. No yelling, no grandstanding, just humiliation. Their power, their bravado crumbled in front of me. I stood there by my pool, the Arizona sun beating down, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself smile. Vindication washed over me like cool water. And as word spread through the neighborhood about the sheriff laughing in their faces about the evidence I'd laid down, the whispers shifted. Even Karen's so-called allies started keeping their distance. The intimidation evaporated, replaced with quiet. My pool was still mine, my sanctuary safe again. And every time I look at that shimmering water, I remember that moment, the sheriff's laugh echoing like justice itself, cutting two entitled bullies down to size. Lesson learned. Stand firm, because sometimes the only thing arrogance understands is the sound of the law laughing in its face.